I've just come back from America, and in the comedy field and television, I mean, yours is on an equivalent basis. You say to someone, well, first of all, they spot your English. You're English. The first thing they say is, do you know Benny Hill? Not Mrs. Thatcher, not the Queen.
Well, I'm prettier, aren't I? Ain't it the truth?
There are certain names in television history that don't just represent a person. They represent an entire era, a feeling, a kind of laughter that once filled living rooms across the globe. Benny Hill was one of those names. For decades, his show was a phenomenon, a cultural touchstone that transcended borders, languages, and generations. Yet, like so many great things, it came to an end, not with a triumphant final bow, but with a quiet cancellation that signaled the closing of one of comedy's most extraordinary chapters. To understand why The Benny Hill Show mattered, and why it ultimately had to end, you have to understand the man behind it, the world he created, and the world that eventually moved on without him. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 24, 1924, in Southampton, England, into a modest working-class family that had no particular connection to show business. From the very beginning, though, there was something unmistakably different about young Alfred. He was drawn to performance the way some children are drawn to football or painting, with an urgency that couldn't be explained and couldn't be ignored. He began his career the old-fashioned way, working the music halls and theater circuits of 1940s Britain, sharpening his instincts in front of live audiences who had little patience for acts that didn't deliver. Those early years were formative in ways that would shape everything that came after. He learned timing. He learned physicality. He learned that laughter is a language all its own, and that if you master it, you can speak to anyone, anywhere in the world. It was television, however, that would become Benny Hill's true home. When the BBC gave him his own show in 1955, it wasn't immediately clear that the world was witnessing the birth of something legendary. But as the years rolled on and the show found its rhythm, it became undeniable. The Benny Hill Show was unlike anything else on television. It moved fast, it hit hard with visual gags, and it possessed a relentless, almost manic energy that kept audiences leaning forward in their seats. The format was sketch-based, built around rapid-fire comedy sequences that blended slapstick with wordplay, parody with pratfalls, and sharp, observational humor with pure, unapologetic absurdity. At the heart of it all was Benny Hill himself. Endlessly inventive, tirelessly committed, and genuinely gifted in a way that made even the silliest material feel somehow earned. One of the show's most beloved elements was its recurring characters, none more iconic than Fred Scuttle, a bumbling, hopelessly inept everyman who stumbled through life with magnificent incompetence. What many fans didn't know is that the character's name came from a real person, Benny Hill's own dentist, a man by the actual name of Fred Scuttle. Hill thought the name was so perfectly absurd that he couldn't resist immortalizing it on screen. It was a small detail, but it spoke to something important about who Hill was as a comedian. Always alert, always finding the comedy in the mundane corners of everyday life. And then, of course, there were the Hill's Angels, the group of performers whose presence became inseparable from the show's identity and later from its controversies. The chase sequences set to that now legendary piece of music became the show's signature, copied and parodied and referenced so many times over the decades that it practically entered the cultural DNA of anyone who grew up watching television. The music became shorthand for a particular kind of frantic, joyful chaos, and it worked because Benny Hill's physical comedy was exceptional. He wasn't just funny because he had good writers. He was funny because he was a physical performer of rare ability, capable of conveying entire emotional universes through a raised eyebrow or a stumbling walk. When the show moved to Thames Television in 1969, it entered what many consider its golden era. The transition to color television added a new visual dimension to Hill's comedy, and the expanded resources of a commercial network gave the show a glossier, more ambitious feel. The first color episode, titled Super Teach, aired on November 19, 1969, and marked the beginning of a new chapter. International audiences, particularly in the United States, began discovering the show, and Benny Hill's reputation grew from beloved British comedian to genuine global star. There was something about his humor that required no translation. The physical comedy, the exaggerated expressions, the perfectly timed chaos, it all communicated something primal and universal about the human comedy. People laughed not because they understood every cultural reference, but because Benny Hill made them feel something instinctive and joyful. Behind the scenes, however, the creation of The Benny Hill Show was something approaching an obsession. Hill was deeply, almost pathologically dedicated to his craft. Colleagues described him as a perfectionist who would spend extraordinary amounts of time refining a single sketch, adjusting a single joke, perfecting a single piece of physical business that might last only seconds on screen. He was involved in nearly every aspect of production, writing, composing, editing, and directing, a level of creative control that was unusual even by the standards of television auteurs. The music heard throughout the show, much of it was composed by Hill himself, a reflection of another passion that ran alongside his comedy. He was an accomplished saxophone player, and music was woven into his creative identity just as deeply as laughter. This wasn't a man who showed up, delivered his lines, and collected his paycheck. This was an artist who lived and breathed his work in a way that few in television ever have. It's worth pausing on who Benny Hill was away from the cameras, because the contrast with his public persona was striking. Off-screen, he was described as reserved, introspective, and intensely private. He never married, kept his personal life almost entirely out of the public eye, and rarely discussed relationships or anything beyond his professional work and interviews. Where his television character was brash and bold and endlessly playful, the man behind the character was quieter, more thoughtful, more inward-looking. He had close friends who spoke warmly of him, but he kept his inner world carefully guarded from the outside. In an era before celebrity culture demanded total transparency, Hill managed to remain genuinely mysterious, a comedian who made the world laugh while keeping much of himself to himself. His talent wasn't confined to television either. In 1971, Benny Hill released a song that stunned the music industry by climbing to the very top of the UK singles chart, where it stayed for 4 weeks. The track told a comedic tale of a milkman and his rival, and the fact that it became a genuine pop hit said everything about Hill's ability to make people smile across any medium he touched. He wasn't just a television comedian. He was an entertainer in the fullest and most classical sense of the word. But even the most brilliant careers exist within a broader context, and by the 1980s, that context was shifting in ways that would prove difficult to navigate. Television was changing, audiences were changing. The comedy landscape was evolving rapidly, with alternative comedy emerging as a sharp, politically conscious counterpoint to the more traditional humor that shows like Benny Hill's represented. Critics who had long held reservations about the show's treatment of women began making their voices heard more insistently, arguing that the bawdy sketches and the parade of attractive female performers perpetuated sexist stereotypes that had no place in a more enlightened era. Some of this criticism was fair, some of it was overstated, but all of it had an effect. Media watchdog groups intensified their scrutiny of the show's content, and advertisers, always sensitive to association with controversy, began distancing themselves from the program. Without the financial support of advertisers, the economic foundations of the show began to crack. At the same time, Hill's insistence on creative control, admirable as it was artistically, made it difficult to adapt the show in ways that might have satisfied critics or revitalized its audience. He had built his comedy on very particular terms, and those terms were his and his alone to set. When the world around him changed, he couldn't simply reinvent himself to fit the new landscape, or perhaps more accurately, he wouldn't. His integrity as a performer was inseparable from his stubbornness as an artist. In 1989, Thames Television made the decision not to renew The Benny Hill Show for another season. The announcement was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No grand farewell, no ceremonial send-off for a program that had brought laughter to hundreds of millions of people across the globe. After more than 3 decades, the curtain came down with a surprising lack of ceremony. Hill took it hard. He never recaptured the heights of his television career in the years that followed, and while he continued to make occasional appearances, the world had already moved on in ways that made a triumphant return unlikely. There was one final gift for fans, though. In 1991, just 1 year before his death, Benny Hill filmed a 1-hour television special called Benny Hill's World Tour, New York. And it was a reminder of everything that had made him extraordinary. Taking his comedy to the streets of one of the world's most chaotic and vibrant cities, Hill interacted with real New Yorkers, incorporated the energy of the city into his sketches, and proved that even approaching the end, his comedic instincts were as sharp and his timing as precise as ever. American audiences who watched the special were treated to a masterclass in universal comedy, humor that needed no explanation, no cultural translator, no shared reference point beyond the simple shared human experience of finding life absurd and wonderful in equal measure. Tragically, Benny Hill died on April 20, 1992, of a heart attack at the age of 68. He had suffered heart problems in his later years, and the health challenges had taken their toll on his energy and his ability to perform with the same volcanic intensity that had defined his peak. His death brought an outpouring of tributes from fans and fellow comedians around the world, all of them grappling with the same strange grief that comes when someone who made you laugh is suddenly gone. The laughter doesn't disappear, it stays preserved in the recordings, embedded in the memory, but the knowledge that no new laughter is coming carries its own particular weight. The legacy of the Benny Hill Show is complicated, as the legacies of great things often are. It was a product of its time, which means it carried both the virtues and the limitations of that time. It was also a work of genuine creative genius, shaped by a man who dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of laughter and gave audiences around the world something rare, pure, uninhibited, joyful comedy that asked nothing more of its viewers than to sit back and let themselves enjoy it. Whatever its flaws, whatever the debates it continues to inspire about the boundaries of humor and the responsibilities of entertainment, the Benny Hill Show represented something irreplaceable. It showed what television comedy could be at its most inventive, most committed, and most alive. And Benny Hill, the shy, private, saxophone-playing perfectionist from Southampton who made the whole world laugh, remains one of the most remarkable entertainers the small screen has ever produced.